What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? Content warning: gruesome war crimes, torture, RS assault, and animal abuse. Project Sunshine, where the US government bought remains of dead infants to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral because doctors had removed her legs and didn't want her to find out. Jeffrey Dahmer's full confession, a couple of 100 pages of pure madness: necrophilia, dismemberment, skinning, lobotomy, body part preservation, cannibalism. Dahmer became pretty close to his interrogating detectives, Dennis Murphy and Patrick Kennedy, and provided a lot of detail to them, a lot of it in a pretty candid, offhand manner. After the My Lai massacre, killing of around 400 to 500 innocent civilians at Vietnam after an army troop killed an entire village, the US government established a group to investigate other war crimes like this occurring in Vietnam, the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group. They found 28 massacres of equal or greater magnitude than My Lai that the public was unaware of, so literally thousands of innocent people killed by US soldiers. The information has since been reclassified, but there were several journal articles on it when it was first released. This is the kind of monstrous stuff that you hate to hear about. The absolute cruelty of killing innocent civilians like they did in My Lai is inexcusable. If you feel the need to try to defend this kind of behavior, do it on your way out the door. American radiation experiments: feeding radioactive material to mentally disabled children, enlisting doctors to administer radioactive iron to impoverished pregnant women, exposing US soldiers and prisoners to high levels of radiation, irradiating the testicles of prisoners, which caused severe birth defects, exhuming bodies from graveyards to test them for radiation without the consent of the families of the deceased. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against US civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. So it's completely feasible that 9/11 was a false flag operation. One US bomber accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb a short distance from a major US city, can't remember which, but luckily it didn't detonate. Off the coast of Georgia. They still haven't found it. No, they know exactly where it is. It would just be more dangerous to retrieve it than to just leave it alone. It's off the coast of Savannah. My hometown was littered with radioactive waste by the federal government as part of the Manhattan Project. I grew up 2 miles from the LOOW, Lake Ontario Ordnance Works site, and my dad grew up on 89th Street in Niagara Falls in the 40s. He says that he remembers sitting on the train tracks as a kid watching the Hooker chemical trucks bring in 55-gallon drums to the Love Canal. That whole area was contaminated with all sorts of nasty stuff. So what did? They bulldozed it over and built a house on it, of course. Then in the 70s, when people were noticing toxic sludge in their basements, kids' feet were being literally burned by the high levels of phosphorus in the ground, and people were getting sick, they acted like they knew nothing. Eventually, people sued and the whole area was evacuated. They tried to clean it up, but they basically put tons of dirt and clay over the area as a cap, and it's all fenced off. You can see it when you drive east on the Niagara Falls Expressway to Towanda. For the Lewiston storage sites, also known as the NFSS Niagara Falls storage site, I've read documents where they had hazardous storage barrels sitting exposed to the elements with seepage and all that. Again, they've covered everything with clay to stop it, but it's already in the ground. The bad thing is that there's a large elementary and high school, Lewiston Porter, about 2 miles from the site, which is actually on property that used to be part of the site but was never used and was sold to the county. Needless to say, the cancer rate among long-term staff and teachers is higher than average. I'm glad to have finally moved away. You never like to hear about crap like this being covered up by the government. You should never fully trust your government. That's why we need checks and balances. Whatever, you get it. But we should at least be able to trust them to not poison us with toxic waste. The Department of Health and Human Services practiced female sterilization on Native American women all the way through the 1970s. Kinda sobering knowing that we were using tax dollars to suppress indigenous birth rates less than 50 years ago. I think even recently in Manitoba, there's been reports of hospital staff telling local indigenous women who'd just given birth that they aren't allowed to see their babies unless they consent to sterilization. First Nations are still incredibly vulnerable, and the West is still feeling aftershocks of genocide. Operation Mockingbird, Operation Northwoods, Operation Paperclip, the fact that we pardoned Unit 731, the list goes on and on. Unit 731 makes Mengele look like a pediatrician with good bedside manner. They were a Japanese experimental group that tested various chemical, biological, and psychological weapons in people using the most brutal methods possible. Vivisection, amputation, removing vital organs, gas chambers, spinning people in centrifuges until they died, putting people in vacuum chambers until their bodies popped from lack of pressure, bombarding people with radiation until they died. They forced men to R women to spread syphilis to the population and test the effects on people. They also spread the Black Death and Manchuria through fleas. R'd babies into women to perform experiments on different stages of pregnancies, burned the corpses of their victims so no accurate number of victims exist. At least 600,000 were infected with plague. The big kicker is all the main leaders of the group were granted complete immunity from post-war tribunes by the US and US alone in exchange for the information gleaned from their vicious and brutal mad scientists. It's basically one of the most horrible things from the Second World War, and almost no one knows about it. And the US really wants it that way. CIA invested millions in trying to make cat spies. $20 million to be precise. I don't know, the way my friend's cat is staring at me right now, maybe they succeeded. As a part of the Army and CIA's experiments into mind control, they put electrodes into the pleasure centers of dogs' brains. Initially, they wanted hundreds of dogs. They only actually got 10, and of those, only a few were implanted. The ones which would be remote controlled by zapping them and essentially giving them a dose of dopamine when they were facing the right direction. The controllers would stop the dope zap when they wanted the dogs to stop, and then the dog would reorient themselves until they were facing the correct direction. This meant when the controllers weren't present, the dogs who had been implanted would continually spin in circles, even in their cages, always looking for the direction that gave them the next hit. The program ran out of funding in the mid-60s, and the dogs were destroyed. Dear the Army and CIA from the 60s, how about you go walk into the ocean and never come back, you heartless pieces of crap? What the hell is wrong with people? CIA involvement in starting the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted 36 years and led to the genocide of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people. Canadian here, the Somalia affair. Not sure if it was ever classified, but definitely a horrific scandal. A now disbanded division of the Canadian military torturing a kid to death in the 90s and taking hero pics with him while doing it. I think it's important to remember when your country does something crappy, it's not always the bad guys who can be effing evil. Not really terrifying, but effed up. Operation Paperclip, where after World War II, the US government took Nazi scientists and shipped them to America to do science. Some of them came straight from Nuremberg cells, the most noteworthy being Wernher von Braun. Von Braun built the V-2 rocket with Jewish slave labor. Every day they would execute the 5 slowest workers in front of the other workers to incentivize them to work harder. Once he came to America, we shipped him to Huntsville, Alabama, where he built the Saturn V, the rocket used in the Apollo program, and got us to the moon. It's not a declassified document, but a friend of mine that served in Desert Storm told me some things. Every morning during muster, their group was given a small pill to take, supposedly to protect them from the toxins the Iranians were releasing into the air. My friend thought it was odd, and he never swallowed his pill, just as some other members of their group didn't. Years go by, and all of the people that he still talks to that took the pill have cancers of various types, as well as a plethora of other medical issues. The ones that did not take the pill seemingly have nothing wrong with them other than normal effects of being middle-aged. Some crazy stuff, and often the military enlisted become guinea pigs for the government without their knowledge or consent. What better way to thank the people who are putting their lives on the line to try to protect the country than to use them as science experiments? Well, at least they're consistently doing such a great job of taking care of our vets, he said, sarcasm thick as a London fog. Operation Mockingbird, where it was found the CIA employed about 400 top journalists in the 1960s to put out propaganda. They were caught, but it never stopped. LOL, the most terrifying one isn't anywhere near the top. The Snowden files, the US government mass surveillance projects. Capitalize mass because they are collecting upwards of 50 to 75% of all communication in the US. That is an incredible violation of our right to decline unwarranted search and seizure. Not declassified, but rather leaked by a man named Gary Webb, who committed self-termination by shooting himself in the back of the head twice with a shotgun. Wrote a book called The Dark Side, detailing how the CIA smuggled crack into inner cities to be distributed among lower-class black neighborhoods. Dyatlov Pass. That's some of the freakiest crap ever. Basically, a group of college kids went on a hiking trip in Siberia. They don't return, and a rescue party went out to find them. They found the bodies scattered around with various injuries. One was found with their eyes and tongue missing. None of them were clothed. They were just wearing underwear in temperatures so cold skin exposure could lead to instant frostbite. Their clothes were found neatly packed up in their campsite along with their stove and the rest of their supplies. Radiation was found on their clothes as well. The tents appear to have been cut open from the inside. When the time came for their funeral, the USSR tried to cover up their deaths, even tearing down pamphlets about the funeral on the college campus where they were living before they died. Freaky crap. Edit. What I personally think happened is that the hikers witnessed a Soviet weapons test and then they were killed by the military because they weren't supposed to witness it. But there are plenty of theories. The complete effing madness that was Chernobyl. The only man who survived being in the power plant had to have every bit of skin replaced. He can't touch gasoline. People basically melting from the inside. Concrete walls turned to liquid. People vaporized in the initial explosion. Firefighters falling to their knees and vomiting their literal guts up. Complete madness. CIA document on how Hitler did not die after the war but escaped to South America where he lived out the rest of his life. Is that an actual declassified document somewhere? Because I feel like that is more of a conspiracy theory. Like, maybe not the most unbelievable one, I don't know, but like, I think if that was confirmed in a declassified document, it would be talked about a little more. Not technically declassified, but the leaked Panama Papers revealed a global network of billionaires and politicians conspiring to launder money and evade taxes. The surprisingly terrifying part is that, by and large, they got away with it. I think in the US, one person has been indicted. One. Not sure when/if it was considered declassified, but the Brits' bioweapons program during the Cold War was pretty extensive. Grenard Island off the coast of Scotland was a major testing ground where they'd cluster bomb anthrax on sheep and then watch them melt, basically. When they tested the soil years later, they found 1 gram still contained tens of thousands of anthrax spores. Government then dumped about 300 tons of formaldehyde on the island to decontaminate. Apparently, it's okay now. During Prohibition in the US, the government wanted to prevent people from making moonshine out of ethanol, so they just low-key added poison to ethanol supplies. An estimated 10,000 people died as a result. If the government did an advertising campaign informing people of this, it wasn't good enough. The Rendlesham Forest Incident. A nuclear-armed silo based in the UK, top-secret security clearances, and they have a UFO come and disable their missile system at the height of the Cold War and possible missile exchanges. Well documented. The one guy's account is so effing scary. Lost a bunch of time, then suddenly develops a heart murmur and scarring on his heart and internal organs that wasn't there previously. So a few people mentioned weaponry being declassified, but there is one that is still classified that we know a bit of info about. Project Sundial. This is a nuclear design with a potential 10 gigaton yield. So large that the US military initially turned down the idea and called it a doomsday device. The designer said, paraphrasing, "This is a bomb you never have to use. Just leave it sitting in your backyard and nobody will bother you. It is so powerful the military turned down the design because it had no strategic use." Another quote, "It would have been a better world without Teller." The Broken Arrow incidents. Basically, the US lost 32 nuclear bombs during the Cold War and none of them have been found to this day. I'm beginning to have some severe trust issues with the government, partially because of secrets they've intentionally kept and partially because of their ineptitude. The UK government's Operation Legacy, in which they systematically destroyed evidence of atrocities they had committed over the years of the British Empire. For example, it isn't really a known fact that the UK had concentration camps in Kenya where they routinely castrated, arred, and massacred people. The government didn't want the former colonies to get a hold of the files, so shredded, burned, and buried them at sea. Operation Sea Spray is a fun one. In 1950, the U.S. Navy sprayed a cloud of bacteria over San Francisco in a biological warfare experiment under Operation Sea Spray just to see what happened. 11 patients at a local hospital developed very rare, serious infections, and it led to the death of one patient. Cases of pneumonia also increased in San Francisco after the experiment. The CIA involvement in the Indonesian mass killings of 1965 to 1966. There was a coup claiming to counter a planned military coup and protect the president. It failed after killing 6 senior military officers, and the president was put under house arrest and the military took over in a counter-coup. The Communist Party was claimed and purged. 500,000 to 3 million civilians died, and the CIA gladly supplied arms and a list of suspect communists to kill. This killed any leftist political movements in Indonesia, and the left is still dead there today. It is still illegal to be an atheist or a communist today. You must be one of the 6 official religions, and it is printed on your ID card. Quite literally, no one knows of one of the largest political massacres in history. The Pentagon Papers highlighted that the U.S. military leadership provoked and lied, entered armed conflict with North Vietnam, and also knew that the war was unwinnable. 58,000 U.S. servicemen died in the conflict, many of them serving against their will. Not necessarily declassified, but that in 1921 the United States Army actually flew airplanes over and bombed Tulsa, Oklahoma, in an area come to be known as Black Wall Street. It was a place where blacks flourished, doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs. So a race riot was started, and they likely killed hundreds of blacks and destroyed thousands of homes and businesses. Factor IV, a medicine for hemophiliacs, was infected with AIDS and sent overseas to sell to save Bayer from losing money. MK-Ultra, the CIA's own mind control program. The fact that people were subjected to hallucinogens and other chemicals, endured physical, and mental torture at the hands of a government agency is disturbing. Also, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, a fabricated attack on U.S. ships for an excuse to escalate the Vietnam conflict. I'll actually admit, I don't know a lot about MK-Ultra, but it is one of those things we've brought up in videos a few times. Frankly, it's spoken about in such a disturbing way that I'm a little afraid to actually read up on it at this point. Area 51 was never publicly acknowledged by the US government until around the 2010s, if I recall correctly. The reason was because many contractors who had worked there had inhaled fumes. Lead paint and other classified materials are disposed in a trench on site and routinely burned, where the fumes could be inhaled and were dying. All they wanted to know was what fumes they had inhaled so their doctors could save them. The answer they ultimately got was essentially, okay, yes, this place exists, we used to make reconnaissance aircraft there, but you're not allowed to know what it is that's killing you. None of the contractors survived, but because of their lawsuit, the government finally acknowledged Area 51. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments were pretty awful. Lasting from 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service injected thousands of African Americans with syphilis under the guise of free health care for clinical studies. They were also encouraged to have intercourse with as many people as possible in order to see the effects of syphilis as it passed through patients. Not so much government documents, but the Catholic Church and the history of priests abusing children and nuns while the higher-ups looked the other way, not in one local church or city, but all over the world. We knew Pearl Harbor was going to happen. We warned no civilians. We left sailors in harm's way on purpose to get involved in World War II. That is also why the aircraft carriers were out on maneuvers at the time. Operation Midnight Climax. The government hired intercourse workers to dose Johns with LSD for research purposes, so to speak. There are over 50 mishaps with nuclear weapons by the U.S. Air Forces in the 1950s alone. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. British Metropolitan Police Services have done exactly the same thing on ecological protesters from organizations like Greenpeace. There was literally a case a few years back, like 5 years ago. An undercover cop, I believe, married and even had kids with a protester he was investigating the whole way through. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.